We're going to start working with something new, and we're going to stick with it for probably like 10 days or so. And it's these little creatures called aquatic macroinvertebrates. And I'll tell you more about them in just a second. But before I do, I want to set the stage, give you kind of big picture stuff, which is that we're still working on ecology. We worked on ecology when you went out and made observations of just random stuff. We were working on ecology when you started looking at plants. We were looking at ecology when you came up with a question, collected data, interpreted your data, and wrote up a paper to answer your question. All of that stuff was within the context of ecology. My scientific training, my background is in ecology, and one of the reasons for that is because ecology is huge, right? So you can look at plants, or you can look at aquatic organisms in the creek. We're going to look at another kind of organism called a lichen. We'll do that after we do this. There's all sorts of stuff that you can look at in the context of ecology. So we're still talking about interactions. We're still trying to think about that basic ecological question of why do organisms live where they do and in the abundance that they do. And as part of that, we're going to start thinking about some more complex concepts like biodiversity, which is going to be hinted at. We're going to allude to that today, but we're not really going to get into the details. The skills we're going to work on today specifically are being able to identify these critters and being able to collect them from the creek, like without causing trauma to them or to ourselves. And we're gonna, they're small, so we're gonna have to use microscopes to see them and identify them. And just a quick reminder, if you like to write everything down, I love that. This is posted to Canvas so you can get stuff later. I'm gonna leave enough time in general for you to write down what I underline. So you don't need to write this down because I didn't underline it, but just be aware that this is what we're working on. These are the skills we're working on. Aquatic macroinvertebrates are awesome. They are tiny creatures. They're small. They do not have backbones, and they live in the water. And I think it's kind of interesting for those of you who are like linguistically inclined, people who really like to think about words and word origins and stuff. All of those descriptive characteristics are incorporated into the name of these creatures. Aquatic macroinvertebrates tells you that they live in the water, that's the aquatic part, that they're small but visible, that's the macro part, and invertebrate means that they don't have backbones. So all this fancy stuff up here and all this not so fancy stuff here means the same thing. Aquatic macroinvertebrates, small, you can see them without using a microscope, but we probably won't be able to ID many of them without a microscope. Some of them are big enough that we can look at them and be like, I know what that is, but many of them are so small that despite the fact that we can see them, we're gonna need to pop them under a scope to figure out what they are. And the ones that we're gonna be looking at, so aquatic macroinvertebrates are actually they are part of a life cycle of flying organisms. So what we're going to be looking at, not exclusively, but often, are larvae of flying insects. We're going to be looking at things like this. This looks like a creepy crawly, and in fact, it is a creepy crawly, but during the course of its life cycle, it will hatch and turn into a flying insect, and that flying insect will lay eggs in the creek, and then those eggs hatch and turn back into the creepy crawlies. These kinds of organisms that change dramatically over the course of their lifestyle are often referred to as metamorphic. So they change a lot in their appearance. It's not like us. Humans are born, and yeah, babies are different from adults, but basically everything's the same, just proportions shift. These organisms look dramatically different as flying adults than they do from aquatic larvae. They are important to think about in terms of ecology because they form the base of the food web for other organisms in the creek. So a lot of fish and amphibians and other organisms that live in the creek, including some other aquatic macroinvertebrates, use these things as a food source. One of the organisms that we're going to look at are called stoneflies, and I've heard stoneflies referred to as candy for trout. Fish like survive on these things, and this incidentally is why I'm here right now. These little organisms are why I'm here right now. When I was in my early 20s, I liked fishing. I would just go out and go fishing. I was living in Eugene. I'd go out to the Mackenzie and fish. And my dad thought, well, maybe I would like fly fishing, which I'd heard of, but I didn't even know what it was. I'd heard of it, and that's it, basically, which is probably about the same as some of you. Well, with fly fishing, what you're trying to do is make it look like your hook is one of these little creatures. And if you have a fly on your line that looks enough like these things, and then you kind of make it behave like one of these things, then the fish will try to eat it, and then you catch a fish. And so at that time, I had no interest in science, no interest in biology. But as I started fishing, I became really interested in these little creatures, and I started learning about them. Then I started learning about stream ecology, and then I started learning about forest ecology, and then the world of biology was opened up to me. So for the record, these things are awesome, and I certainly understand if it's not your thing. I get it. Nobody's gonna make you enthusiastic about aquatic macroinvertebrates, but I know they can be fun, because not only are they fun for me, but they changed the path of my career, which was pretty exciting for me at the time, and I'm pretty happy about it now. In the Willamette Valley, we have, there's a bunch that we're gonna look at. You don't need to write, you do need to write this down, but what I want you to do is add a little bit of space after each one of these things. We're gonna take a look at all of these. So we're gonna look at true flies, caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, and snails. Write down all those names while I'm yakking at you, but leave a little bit of space for I'm gonna add a little bit of information for you to write down that will help you identify them, okay? So these are not the only aquatic macroinvertebrates that are found in the Willamette Valley. There's dozens of them. And these aren't species. These are a different kind of group. These four groups are taxonomic groups called orders. These are insect orders. And this taxonomic group is a genus. We're not going to talk too much about taxonomy in this class. It's its own biological topic. Some people find it really interesting, and there's a purpose to thinking about it. But in general, just understand that there are many different groups and species of all of these things, and we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to think about the bigger groups of them. And you are not going to have to memorize these. You're not going to have to know how to spell them. You're not going to have to pronounce them correctly. What I want is two things. One is I want you to be familiar with them. So if I talk about them, or you read about them, or somebody else talks about them, I don't want you to think, what? What is that word? I've never thought of that word in my life. I want you to be like, oh yeah, I know that one. We talked about that one. That's one of our bugs. And I want you to be able to use resources to speak or write intelligently about them. So that means things like you can use your notes. If I show you an organism and I'm like, what is this? I would like you to go to your notes and be like, oh, that's a mayfly, order Ephemeroptera, and then tell me something about it. So it's not memorization, it's familiarity that I'm looking for. And I'm gonna read all these to you so that you hear the pronunciation, and then you'll hear the pronunciation many more times. Again, not so that you know how to pronounce them right, although that'll help, but mostly just so that you know what I'm saying when I say one of these words, all right? So the first group are true flies, which are Diptera, and true flies include flies, like the common housefly is in this group, Diptera. It also includes like mosquitoes and gnats, a whole bunch of other flying insects that we're very familiar with fall into this category of true flies. The next group are the caddisflies, which are, the order is Trichoptera. And caddisflies, of all of these, are my favorite. You'll see why when we get there. There's mayflies, and the group, the order for mayflies is pronounced Ephemeroptera. There's stoneflies. These are the ones that trout really love. These are trout candy, and that order is pronounced Plecoptera. And then there's snails, which you're all familiar with. We have one common type of snail. It's a genus that we're going to see a lot of them, and it's pronounced Juga. This word genus is not part of the name. This is just this is describing the taxonomic level. These are all orders. This is a genus, and that is just sort of like be aware of that. And I'm not going to be like quizzing you on which of these is an order and which is a genus and things like that. Okay, let's see. So let's go through and take a look at some of these. So the first group that we're going to look at are the true flies, or the Diptera, and so these often either have no visible heads at all, or the heads are real small. And you'll see in a second that's really different from the other three larvae that we're looking at. The other three larvae, it's really obvious. They have a head and they have a tail. And the head looks like a head. It looks like a bug's head, but it's very clearly a head. These organisms, not so much. I mean, you can probably kind of pick out, like on this one, it's pretty easy to see the head if you look carefully. On this one, it's a little harder. This one, I honestly I think it's here, but it's really hard to tell where the head is. They don't have legs, and they may have little protrusions, but they're not jointed legs like the other organisms that we're going to be looking at. And then they look like little worms. So if you see things that look more like worms than anything else, now it's possible that we'll see some actual worms today. That happens. But if we see organisms that look like worms but aren't, they're almost certainly true flies, Diptera. And the two that we see most commonly, there's one kind that it'll kind of grab onto the bottom of whatever container it's in, and then it sticks its abdomen, its tail up in the air, and will kind of wave it around. So it almost looks like a caterpillar or something, where its front legs are attached and it's just waving its back legs around. It's not a caterpillar, but that's sort of what it looks like. The other kind, they're often red like this, and they can attach too, but more frequently we'll just sort of see them thrashing around in the water. So you'll see this little tiny red thread-like thing thrashing around, and that's one of these as well. Okay, and when you look at them under a microscope, it's pretty easy to tell that it's not a worm, and it's pretty easy to tell that it's not one of the other organisms that we're going to be looking at. The next group, and this is my favorite group, are the caddisflies, or Trichoptera. And these, I like these because they build houses, and that is astounding. What they do, the biology and the chemistry and the physics of it is just sort of amazing. Basically what they do is they take different species, build houses out of different things. So some build houses out of sticks, some build them out of like mud, and some build them out of rocks, and some build them out of leaves, but they all kind of build them the same way, which is that they cement little particles together, pieces of leaf or dirt or rock, with their saliva. And their saliva is basically like cement. So they build a house for themselves, and then they live in the house. And it's crazy, because most of the time we don't think of like insect larvae as having that level of behavioral sophistication. Like, we think of insect larvae as basically like existing to spook us, and that's sort of it. But these, the fact that they build little houses kind of gives them a little personality. When they hatch, They have these little wings that they fold back over them, and they kind of look like little moths. They're not, but they sort of look a little bit like moths when they've hatched. If you see what I call a naked caddisfly, then it'll look more like this, and it'll have a very obvious head, and it will have legs, and the legs are always real close to the head. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because since they build these houses, it makes sense for their legs to be close to the head so that when they need to move around, they can just like put just a little bit of their body out, and then they use their legs to propel themselves. They don't have to extract their whole body from their house in order to be able to move. And then they have these tail hairs that are sort of feathery appendages that are at the tip end of the creature. So we may see some naked caddisflies. That happens. We may see some caddisflies in houses. This time of year, historically, we haven't seen a ton of these. We have a lot in the creek. We tend to see them more in the spring if we do a collection in the spring. Okay, so those are caddisflies or Trichoptera. And then the next group is the mayflies, Ephemeroptera, and there's a few things you can look for with mayflies. The giveaway is if they have 3 tails. If they have 3 tails, it's a mayfly. If you see something with 1, 2, 3 tails, 1, 2, 3 tails, mayfly. But some mayflies only have 2 tails. If you see something with 2 tails, then it might be a mayfly, or it might be something else, which we'll look at in just a second. If it's a mayfly, in addition to the tails as a distinguishing feature, they also have feathery abdominal gills. So these are the gills right here. You can see these long feathery things. Those are gills. These are gills right here. These are gills. They look like feathers. They're not. They are what allow these organisms to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide through water. So they have gills like fish. Fish gills are near their head, and they're behind a bony plate. So we see that like bony plate, and we think, oh, those are the gills, but the gills are underneath that thing. Gills are often real feathery. They have a huge surface area to volume ratio to maximize gas exchange. So these are gills. And they're on the abdomen of the creature, which seems weird, except not really. I mean, we think of gills, we think of respiratory organs as, well, you want that close to like the head or whatever, but you don't necessarily. It doesn't matter at all where they are. They just have to be there. And then this, we don't have to worry about small mouth parts. And this is so funny because every time I do this presentation, it's out of order. And every time I do that, I think, oh, I gotta change that. And then every time I forget. This is the other key piece of information though. 1 claw at the tip of each leg. You can see it really clearly right here. You'll be able to see it under a dissecting scope. If you look at these things and you look at the very tips of their legs, you'll see 1 claw that can kind of move like this. And so they can't grab things with 1 leg. They can propel themselves, and they have a claw that they can use for gripping onto things and holding on, but they don't have 2 claws that operate like this. Okay. So if you see one of these AMIs with 3 tails, it's a mayfly. If you see one with 2 tails, you have to look more closely. You have to check where are the gills located and how many claws does it have. If the gills are on the abdomen and it has 1 claw at the tip of each leg, then it's a mayfly. If it has 2 tails, but the legs are 2-clawed, so you can see that here and here really clearly. These organisms have 2 claws at the end of each leg, and they can kind of move like this, so they can grip. And these are stoneflies, which is pronounced Plecoptera. Yeah?
Please tell me these things are like relatively small.
These things are relatively small, yeah. Although, of all the ones that we're likely to see, these are the biggest. So we might see ones that are like this big. And if it freaks you out, it's understandable, but they are harmless. None of these is gonna cause us any trouble at all. They're just harmless little creatures. If they creep you out, then we can accommodate. Like I don't want you to be uncomfortable, but they also are utterly harmless to us. And then the stoneflies, instead of having gills on their abdomens like the mayflies do, they have their gills on their legs. And they're feathery again, so you can see them on these legs. And again, that seems really weird. Why would something have gills on its legs? But it doesn't really matter where they are, right? What gills do is they allow the organism to release carbon dioxide into the environment and get oxygen from the environment. That doesn't have to happen in a certain place. So for stoneflies, they developed gills on their legs, and mayflies developed gills on their abdomen. It's all good. Okay. And the last one that we're gonna see, these are pretty easy to identify. These are snails. Unlike the other ones, these are not like arthropods, they're not insects, and they're not larvae either. They're adults. They're the most common organism that we're likely to see. We're gonna get, like when we collect today, you'll see snails. When we collect next week or the week after, you'll see like dozens and dozens and dozens of snails. Yeah.
Yeah, when we go to the LC and go camping on the LC, when you're walking on the LC, there's like this one segment, we go to a place called Salmonberry.
Yeah.
And there's this one really shallow segment, and you can just see thousands of little snails as you walk across. It's like a invasive species type.
Is it invasive? Do you know?
I don't know.
Because we have native snails, but it could be.
There's like thousands of them. You
Yeah.
walk across and just like
Yeah.
you'll get like in your shoes and just
Yeah.
in your shoes.
Yeah, so that's what our collections are potentially gonna be like in a couple weeks, where we're gonna come back with a bucket, and there could be between 50 and 500 snails in our collections, a lot. Oh yeah,
Leave the crawdads alone.
what's that?
We're gonna leave the crawdads alone.
So we may catch some crawdads, it's just not super likely. In the past, we've caught other things besides these. These are just the most common. We could get crawdads. We could also get little fish called sculpin fish that are in the creek. We've seen other things as well. I can't remember if we've ever caught them, but there's eels in the creek. There's trout in the creek. Like there's a bunch of stuff in there, but these 5 things that I just showed you are the ones we're most likely to see. Yeah.
I did see a crawdad actually yesterday.
Yeah.
There's quite a few of them. There's one that's missing a claw.
Yeah, let me re-answer your question more clearly. We will see them in the creek. It's just not likely that we'll catch them. They tend to, they're not helpless, and they don't want to be caught, and so they're generally not. These little organisms are pretty helpless, as you'll see when we do our collection. Did somebody else have a question? Okay, so these guys, when we're identifying them, I mean, you look for snails, and if you find one, then it's this. The only thing to watch out for is that sometimes, so like this just obviously looks like a snail. Sometimes just there's variation, and the shells can be really long and narrow, and they can look like a caddisfly. You okay? They can look like a caddisfly, and so when you look at them under a scope, just look for the spiral. If you see a spiral shell, then it's a snail, and if you see some other kind of shell, it's not really a shell. Instead, it's a caddisfly. And then the last thing that I want to this is like kind of for future reference. We're gonna take this and we're gonna think about ecology with these creatures, and so we're gonna use them as the basis for an ecological study. for the past month or so, I've been trying to help you figure out how you can we came up with questions. We were thinking about questions. What is our question? How can we answer it? For this study, we're going to focus more on getting really good data and having something that maybe will, so with the plant study, I kept telling you, like, this probably doesn't mean anything. But for this, we're going to get data that almost certainly is going to be meaningful. So I want you to write this down. You don't need to memorize it, but just be aware that this is going to be our big question. And we'll talk about all the details of this, talk about how to make the measurements and what they mean and stuff. The question is going to investigate the relationship between the diversity of these aquatic macroinvertebrates and their habitat. And in particular, we're going to look at water speed and depth, which sounds like two things, but actually, water speed and depth are sort of the same thing. What happens with water speed and depth is faster areas tend to be shallower. So we can think about it in terms of the water speed, or we can think about it in terms of the water depth. Either way, we're talking about the same areas. Fast, shallow areas versus slow, deep areas. So in order to be able to evaluate the diversity of these aquatic macroinvertebrates, the first thing that you all are going to need to be able to do is identify them. So that means that we have to collect them and we have to be able to look at them. So I'm going to just walk you through a very brief procedure for collecting these things. It turns out this is not exactly how we're going to do it when we conduct our study. We have another way of doing things that will get us more organisms. But for today, this will be this will just kind of be a quick way to be able to get a glimpse of these organisms. And the one thing to recognize is that you personally may not collect any of these. Sometimes people go out and they just kind of come back empty. But as a group, we will almost certainly see at least stoneflies, mayflies, and true flies, and snails. What we probably won't see are caddisflies. We might, but probably not. When we collect for the study, we're going to use a slightly different method, and we will be able to see caddisflies almost certainly then. So here's our collection procedure. And I believe that I warned you guys about my artistic skills. And now you see why I warned you. Like, this actually is potentially going to traumatize some of you. You may never recover from this. You may need therapy because you're looking at my drawings. But I do the best I can, so I'm not going to apologize. So the first thing is, so this is fun, and I want you all to have fun, but recognize that especially when it's wet, the rocks are not super safe. So if you don't have to like go climb out on the rocks. If you want to like perch on some rocks, that's up to you. You might fall in, you might get wet. The creek is not high enough that I'm worried about any kind of like you're not gonna drown in water that's this shallow, but you could hit your head and you could very easily get cut, or like at a minimum, you might get dirty or wet. So if you don't wanna get dirty or wet or fall, just be super careful when you're out there. It's not mandatory that you put yourself in that situation. I prefer that you don't, but I also know some of you are gonna get down there and you're gonna wanna like balance on a rock. So just be aware, it's not as safe as it might look. Later in the year, it's probable that at least one point the creek is going to get high enough that it is incredibly dangerous. Like, we get floods along this creek. But for right now, it's shallow and mellow, and that's what I would like you to be too. Mellow. You don't have to be shallow, just be mellow. Yeah.
How deep does the creek get on like an average?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. years ago, I decided I was gonna walk. While one of the classes did this, I walked from the creek where it comes in on Highland all the way as far as I could up by the baseball fields. And there were places that were above my waist, and that was in September. So there's some really deep spots. Most of it this time of year, like it wouldn't even come up to my ankles. But, you know, once the rains come, if it rains even normally this year, then for much of the year, it's gonna have some deep spots in it, even like right by the quad and stuff. Okay, and then the next piece is be respectful of the environment. We're gonna catch these critters. We wanna look at them, which means we're gonna like disrupt them. But we wanna disrupt them as little as possible. The most important thing is to try to keep them alive and then get them back into the creek. If we keep them alive and get them back into the creek, then we really haven't done any harm. Some of them will probably end up dying because they're small and they're relatively fragile, and that's not ideal, but let's try to limit that as much as possible. Here's what the collection procedure looks like. You're gonna have 3 people in each group. You've gotta have 3 people, because you just, like, it won't work if you try to do this with just 2 people. One person is gonna have one of these buckets, like, they're not buckets, but like trays, like this. And that person is gonna go to the creek, and you're gonna scoop some water in there. You want it to be like maybe a third or a half full. You don't need a ton of water. These organisms live in water though. So if we come back with the organisms and they don't have any water, then they're gonna die. And if you try to use tap water, that is treated, it's got chlorine in it, and that's not great for these. So creek water in the bucket. The person with the tray, just stand there with your water in your tray and stand by. The other 2 people are gonna use shovels and nets. And the collection procedure it's really easy to execute. It's not, there's no like finesse required. But basically what you're gonna do is you'll have one person standing upstream, which means the water is gonna flow from them to the person with the net. The person upstream is the one with the shovel, and you're gonna take the shovel and just kind of like bonk the rocks and the gravel, and if there's sticks in the water, just kind of stir them up. These organisms grab onto things, and if you don't like disturb the habitat, then they won't let go. So if you just put a net in the water, you won't get anything. You have to use this to kind of stir up the rocks and other debris in the creek. And then while the person with the shovel is doing that, the person with the net is gonna stand like 3 to 6 feet away, it's a couple meters, and try to sort of catch. You may be able to see like some dirt or debris coming down, and you can kind of try to catch it with the net. If not, if the water seems really clear even as you're stirring it up, you can still sort of see where the water is flowing. And you want to get the net where the water is flowing so that any organisms that are stirred up by the shovel person end up in the net. And you should do this for like 2 or 3 minutes. When you're done, if you look into your net, chances are you won't see anything alive. You might see a little sculpin fish or a crawdad or something like that, but it's more likely that you're just gonna see nothing at all. And so a lot of times people are like, oh, didn't get anything. But remember, these things are tiny. They're not invisible, they're visible to our eyes, but we're not gonna be able to see them in a net. The net is gonna be filled with little sticks and debris, and it's like dark out there. You're not gonna see them in the net. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your net and you're gonna find your bucket person, and you're gonna walk up to the bucket, you're gonna take the net, you're gonna turn it inside out, and just leave it like resting in the bucket like this, and then come back to the class with your net in the bucket like this. This is how you maximize the number of organisms that you catch, and it's how you maximize the survival of the organisms. Keep the net in the water, turn it inside out, so if you used the net like this, then before you come back to the classroom, you take the net, you turn it inside out, and you get that bottom part in the water. And then you and the bucket person work together to get the net and the bucket back to the classroom. Yeah?
Are we not doing this multiple times?
We're not gonna do it multiple times today. We might do it multiple times down the road.
So we just do it one time?
Yeah, you should probably be able to, in just like 5 minutes, collect a reasonable, yeah, we'll see. If you go out and you come back and you don't have anything, if we have time, you can certainly go back out again. So you're not limited. I want you to see stuff. While you're out there, just remember, number 1, come in and out this door. Number 2, wipe your feet as you come in. Number 3, be safe. And one thing I didn't mention yet, but I will, is that these make great sword fighting implements. I get it, but please don't do that. I don't want you to get hurt, and I don't want the equipment to get damaged. So don't use them as walking sticks, don't use them as swords, just hang on to them and go to the creek and get your samples and come back. When you come back, you can kind of extract all the organisms from your net, and then you can put the nets back where you got them. You can put the shovels back where you got them, and then just hold tight. You can look at your tray and see if you see anything, but I'm gonna wait until everybody's back before I talk about next steps for observing and identifying the organisms. Okay, remember there's a bee's nest out there, and I'm gonna show you where it is. Does anybody have any questions before we head outside? Okey-dokey.